you've seen the pictures from north of Omaha, the Omaha area, with the Missouri River and all the flooding. And then there's a picture of a dam in Mankato, Minnesota. So there's a lot of flooding north of here. It's starting to make its way down on the Missouri River. Downtown Omaha, the town, Hannafin Park is starting to get flooded. There are Interstate 29 and 680 north of Council Bluffs are going to be shut down here shortly. So please be aware of that as we transition into our weekly chat with Brian Christopherson of Husker247. Good morning, BC.
How you guys doing?
College World Series is over, so now we don't know what to do.
Yeah, what do you got for us?
I don't know. We're good at twiddling our thumbs and thinking of something.
Okay, so
talk about the backup left guard or maybe the third string right tackle. We always come up with something.
Yeah. Okay, all right. I see your Sam Sledge. I'll raise you a Gunner Gatula.
How's Tyler Knack coming along?
Tyler Knack. Huh?
Okay, so let's talk about a position group. So Garrett McGuire has murderers, and he's going to be able to get away with it as his wide receivers. I'm looking at running back, and Mekhi Nelson joins the running back room, and we don't expect him to step in and play because he's got to learn some things, but he's already here, so he's with the fellas. If you had to have a word or two to describe, and you can even go to 3 words, I'll allow you to describe like the current state of Nebraska's running back room, what would it be?
Oh, 3 words.
Oh, no, you can go even further. I'm just, because I'm thinking like Garrett McGuire wakes up every day during the summer, and I'm sure he can't wait for the first day of camp because he's got some dudes and he can go pretty deep. Not saying that EJ Barthel doesn't have dudes, but it's a very interesting collection of running backs that he's about to unleash.
Okay. I got 3 words.
Okay.
Prove it time. Prove it time.
Love it. Yeah.
They've got a good mix of veterans with, Mekhi Nelson and Dowdell's an interesting guy still. I mean, just because he wasn't immediately the flavor of the spring doesn't mean he can't take off. We saw sort of last year how that happened with Emmett Johnson, where he was like, 4th or 5th last August, and suddenly he was a starter. Injuries had something to do with it, but he showed he could do it. But you've got guys in Irvin, Ramir, Emmett, who I think is one of the most talked over Huskers, who might be the leader of the crew when it's all said and done, who's to say, who have showed flashes, but there's been sometimes injuries have gotten in the way, or a lack of a passing game also to support them doesn't help matters either. That was one of the interesting things about Rule's quote the other day or last week. It was like, we can run the ball, but not necessarily if the other side can stack the box like they sometimes did last year. One of my main takeaways, everybody's talking about the compliment to the wide receivers, but it was also thinking about, sometimes it is a tough shake for those running backs, the way we evaluate them when you didn't have a real complementary passing game that was going to back some people off and open up some lanes like you're hoping are going to be there this year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big part of it. Like if they can make that at least formidable with the passing game, we might be able to see a little bit more of those like main 3 or 4 guys I mentioned than we even saw last year, where maybe they have a little more space to go. But I think they should go into it as, it's prove it time, and then any competitor should always kind of be thinking that way. But I'm sure they know that there's some people think, that the kind of the book on the running backs is they're good. They have some promise, but do they have that great guy? Like if I'm one of those dudes in the room, I'm ready to go show you, like, yeah, we do. We have a couple of them. And so that's what's got to happen.
On the wide receivers, Brian, we know Banks and Naor are going to get a lot of that attention because of their experience. In your opinion, who is it more important for this offense to succeed, to have a bigger jump in their sophomore year, Malachi or Jalen?
Oh, I don't know if I can pick one above the other, honestly. I think Jalen is naturally ready to break out, and I don't know that Malachi is far behind that. It's just a matter of we didn't see him this spring. So we have a few guys on the roster like that, right, who are sort of out of sight, out of mind because they weren't participating as much, so you didn't read the stories or get the headlines with them. But I know for a fact, and this is maybe where I'll go with the answer, that Garrett McGuire is pretty fired up about having Malachi out there just as like the edge he brings even as a blocker. Like, we can talk about the receiving and how we want that part to really flourish. That's an obvious. But they're going to want to do a lot of stuff with the short passing game, and they're going to want to have really physical specimens on the perimeter who sort of clear lanes for him. And, Bonner's a guy like that. And I think Malachi Coleman showed last year he's a very willing blocker beyond his receiving potential that loves to get in guys' grill and hit them. And so I think that alone is going to be one of those like things maybe not recognized as much when people are just sort of looking at the stats at the end of the year, like, okay, who had this many receiving yards, who was third in receiving, all this stuff. But who are those guys who are doing the dirty work too? Like who's doing that extra stuff? And I think Malachi has that in his game. He's got to prove it too, of course, because he's a young player. But definitely his coaches see that potential in him. And so I think I would just kind of focus on that to that question. I think that the receiving part's going to take off for them naturally enough, but can you do that little stuff that everyone's not recognizing? And I think that's something Malachi really has a want to do. And so here's a chance to show that he's even better at it in year two.
How do you think, you mentioned him in Bonner? How do you, and we know that, we've been tight end, we've been fullback, we were recruited as a wide receiver, we're back to wide receiver. In your ideal world, how do they harness the talent that he has or the potential on what it should look like on when he plays and what role he plays?
Malachi?
Bonner.
Bonner. Bonner. Bonner can just harness the jack of all trades thing you got with him. I mean, he's a guy who was last year lining up and taking the first snap as the fullback in the spring game to honor Frank Solich, and was doing well there. He likes to put his face into it too and hit guys. And I was struck by that as much as almost anything in the spring game when he trotted out with the number one group of wide receivers. And I watched sort of the short passing game with Dylan. And I know it's a scrimmage, but let's be honest, guys. We've seen Nebraska really scuffle sometimes, even with the stuff that you think maybe should be a layup type play, right? Where it's like a screen pass or it's something that's like, let's just get the play moving and let guys get out in space. And sometimes the throw has been off or the rhythm has just not been there. The thing that was encouraging in that particular scrimmage was there was a rhythm to some of the short stuff that you could take for granted. It looked simple, but it hasn't been simple for Nebraska. Yeah. So then if you can get a quarterback who can put it to guys on the short stuff in rhythm, and then you have dudes like Bonner on the outside who are basically giving you like a fullback type option, outside the hashes, right? Where he can clear space sort of like he was going to do last year at a different position. I think that's huge. And so guys like Bonner and, Luke Lindenmeyer, if you want to take it inside more, they're going to be like really important to this whole deal that maybe they won't get talked about as much. But those are the type of players that when Nebraska was great or good, always mattered. Like I call it the Matt Shaw factor. I always think of Matt Shaw when I was a kid, was a tight end who, I don't know if he ever caught a stinking pass, but he just did all the stuff you have to do to win games. And I see Bonner and Lindenmeyer type guys as being really critical to that equation.
BC, I want to go back to running backs here. And you brought up something that I would agree. My mind has put me in a position where I think there's a better chance of lanes for this running back group. Offensive line gives you a little bit better push, the experience and everything that goes with it. Out of the group, if that exists, if you see more consistent offensive line play when it comes to the running game, especially late in games, who do you trust the most to take advantage of that out of that running back group?
I don't know yet. I think that goes with the prove it thing. I mean, it's sort of like Gabe Ervin. You have to say this about him, and he's back and healthy. Rule said last week, 2 different staffs have pointed to him as their starting running back basically heading into a season. Rule staff last year and Frost staff, was it 21, I guess, when the Oklahoma injury happened. So Gabe's got something to him that coaches like. And I think people have to remember even though the running lanes weren't necessarily wide open in some of those early games last year before he got hurt, he had like that run against like Minnesota and Colorado where you saw sort of what Rule and those guys were talking about all offseason, where he like made something out of nothing and busted through a guy, and then suddenly it was like 25, 30 yards. And he does seem like on paper like that guy who could be that fourth quarter, okay, you're going to get your 75 plus yards, which is their goal as a team. He can be that guy who really helps you deliver there. So if he's healthy, I'd love to see what that looks like, but that's the question. Can he like hit the ground on a sprint with full health? Rahmir, I hope, I like when Rule came out and said, I tell the staff, like, go back and look at Rahmir and like how he, lined up as a running back and did natural running back stuff like against Michigan and against Oklahoma in some games a couple of years ago. He's got that in his game. And so I hope there's some emphasis on that, because it does feel to me like whenever Ramirez actually touched the ball, good stuff usually tends to happen. I mean, he's got a really good track record with his sample size. It's just the sample size isn't as big for as long as he's been here. But I'll finish the thought with Emmett Johnson. It always ends up a conversation sort of about Rahmir and Gabe, and I was actually making a list of like who are the most talked over Huskers on this team, and Emmett still is sometimes that way. I feel like with people, they're like, I think that was nice, but these other guys are going to come up and kind of take the snaps. I'm not so sure. We'll see. Emmett Johnson, he's got a little bit. I'm not saying he's going to be Amir or anything, but I remember when Amir Abdullah was coming up as a young player, and everybody wanted to talk about 2 or 3 other guys who came into the same class as him. And then a year or 2 into it, you realize like, oh, it's this guy. This guy's got stuff, And so I want to at least give him the chance to show maybe he's that guy this year. He takes off a little bit. I'm not saying Amir, he's that Amir guy, but he's that guy who's like maybe he's the top of the list.
Brian Christopherson from Husker247 joining us. You can follow BC if you haven't already. Husker247 BC. You have written extensively about it, and I'm really worried about college football from the aspect of the 85-man roster limit that's being talked about and the elimination of walk-ons. I think that will destroy culture. But this seems to be picking up steam, whether it be an 85-man limit, 120-man roster, whatever. Rule talked about it. You've written about it, BC. What's your gut say on what's going to be the end game with this proposal as the result, the impact of the House versus the NCAA settlement?
I don't know if my gut is a good read on it, but I would hope there's enough people in the room that have rosters similar enough to Nebraska's in the Big Ten, if this is a conference by conference type decision ultimately, that say, you know what, it's got to be at least 120. Give us 120 at least. And that's still going to hurt, as you heard Rule last week speak on, like, how hard would it be to go to guy 121 who's maybe like a native son, who's like worked his butt off to be part of your program. Rule obviously knows the value of the walk-on from having been one himself, and he sees it and utilizes it well within the Husker program. I like the fact that Nebraska may have the biggest roster there is with like 145, but as he pointed out, there are some others that are around like 135 and things like that. And so I would just hope there's enough people who stand up and say, think about some of the consequences here and how you're hurting the student athletes who we say we care about if you take some of this away from them. So I hope the number is at least 120. And I guess that maybe some people would say that's a happy medium to the whole discussion. But I hope it doesn't go any lower than that, because I'll tell you what, in my career covering this team, there's been a lot more than just feel good spring fluff stories about guy 123 in the spring. I've seen guy 123 on the roster in the spring end up like making a huge play on third down. I've seen Justin Blatchford. I've seen Matthew May. I've written about these kids who have come up. I could name off 10 of them. I mean, that right now, it's just like the guys who have been in huge roles like Lance Thorell and all these dudes, and you're seeing them on this Husker roster start to emerge. John Bullock was a guy who a year ago we weren't talking about. Now he's a starter and then got a single digit. So I just hope it's spared and enough voices of reason rise up on this discussion.
Yeah, when you say voices of reason, you made me think this is the conversation we talk about, the Power 2, even with the Power 4 structure currently, that the SEC and the Big Ten throw the most weight around right now. Could this be where we get the old Big Ten SEC handshake meme of making something like this happen if coaches are, for the most part, in alignment when it comes to that type of thinking?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope the power players flex on this one, because I think that, the most powerful programs usually have the biggest rosters, and they see what it does for guys. And guys, sometimes guys who don't finish their career at a big school, they still spin off of their experience, having been a walk-on at that program, into another good experience with the blessing of everybody that, they were played with or played under. So all that stuff, I think you got to think about. And I just hope it is at least 120 people on the roster or more.
Do you have any idea, like a timeline on when this will be decided? Because Nebraska has 80 true or redshirt freshmen on a roster of about 140 plus right now.
I don't have a good idea. It was the thing I like about the Matt Rule press conferences is like he comes out and says, like last Thursday or whenever it was, nobody knows yet. Like, I mean, because he's in on the meeting. So like sometimes you'll see this headline here on Yahoo or wherever, and it's like maybe there is something brewing. But it was like, as of 5 days ago, at least the head coach and the athletic director of Nebraska were saying it's still like the beach ball's still in the air on this one, like as far as what they do. So that's where I guess it is. But yeah, I'm watching it closely. I don't have any inside info on what's going to happen, of course, but I'm just a fan of those rosters being a certain size. It doesn't have to be 160 guys, but I think we can find a place in the middle at least.
I agree. BC, as always, I appreciate the time. Thank you, sir.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
And so Brian Christopherson from Husker 247. Well, you limit it to 85. Goodbye.